They didn't dig for monsters. They dug for coal. But the hill answered back. Not with a cave-in, not with gas, with rhythm. 2 taps, a pause, 2 taps again. And whatever was down there had been waiting a very long time. In the winter of 1906, 30 miles from anywhere that mattered, 6 men worked a coal seam that shouldn't have existed. No town, no church, no cemetery, just a narrow-gauge rail spur, canvas tent snapping in the wind, and a ridge of gray stone rising behind camp like a clenched fist. They called it Dry Camp Number 3. No water worth drinking. No women. No future beyond the next paycheck. And that was enough. Men came there because the copper mines had gone quiet. Because hunger makes risks feel smaller. Because when a company man smiles and says rich in a year, gone in 2, you stop asking questions. At first, the work was ordinary. Pick, swing, load, push. Coal dust in the mouth. Cold in the bones. Say misery every mine offers. But hills remember things. And this one had never forgotten. The air inside the drift felt wrong from the beginning. Too still, too dry. Lamps burned thin like the light didn't want to stay. The coal fractured oddly as if it had been moved once. And put back. One of the men noticed it before the others. Alvarez. He'd worked silver in Virginia City. He knew how rock was supposed to sound when it broke. One night, sitting on his bunk with his boots off, he said something no one wanted to hear. The hill is hollow. Not cracked, not faulted, hollow. He said the picks rang differently. Not solid, like striking the side of a barrel. Old spaces behind the seam, empty places where air hadn't moved in generations. The others laughed it off. Men always do. 2 days later, the hill proved him right. A pick broke through the coal face and vanished into darkness. Cold air rushed out, dry and stale, like a breath released after a century of holding it. Lamps flickered. Dripping stopped. Even the mine seemed to listen. Behind that coal wall wasn't just a crack. It was a room. Not natural. Not collapsed. A space shaped with intent. They widened the opening carefully. Enough for a man to squeeze through. When the company manager arrived, clean shirt, soft hands, lamp untouched by dust, he didn't ask if they should explore it. He asked how fast. He asked how fast. That's the first mistake men always make in historical horror encounters. They confuse ownership with safety. Beyond the opening, the chamber curved like an egg laid sideways inside the hill. Packed earth floor, low ceiling. And at the center, something that did not belong there. A pillar. Pale stone, smooth, hard. Not coal, not vein rock. Carved into its surface were shallow lines. Not letters, not symbols anyone recognized. Patterns too deliberate to be chance, too wrong to be decoration. When one of the men touched it, he pulled his hand away without realizing why, because the body knows things before the mind catches up. The floor told another story. Shallow depressions ran across the dust. Not boot prints, not hooves. Each mark had one long end and 2 shorter curved ones, a shape that refused to match anything living above ground. And they were sharp. Recent. Then came the passage, narrow, sloping downward. Walls scarred as if worked by tools that weren't picks, uneven, chipped, patient, as though something had carved this place slowly, over a very long time. That was when they found the strip. Pale, flexible, smooth on one side, ridged on the other. It bent without breaking. Skin doesn't do that unless it belonged to something that wasn't meant for sunlight. No one said the word, but everyone thought it. They went deeper anyway, because history isn't made by cautious men. The passage forked. One side smelled sharp and mineral. The other carried a faint current of air and a sound. Soft, dry, measured, 2 taps. A pause. 2 taps again. Not random, not collapse. Deliberate. Below them, something was working. They chose the branch with moving air because breath means life, and life means answers. That's what explorers always believe right before the ground teaches them humility. The lower chamber was smaller, stranger. Stone rings blackened by old residue, thin bones too brittle to identify. Vertical grooves carved into the wall, shoulder height, evenly spaced, worn smooth by repetition. Not scratches. Habit. And the sound came again. Closer this time. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. When they returned the next day, something had changed. The stone ring had been disturbed. The residue smeared, dark at the edges, and new tracks crossed their own footprints. Fresh, sharp, leading deeper into the hill. That's when the company man brought a pistol underground. That's when the rhythm beneath their feet didn't change at all. It just waited. Because whatever lived below that Nevada ridge didn't need to rush. It already knew the men were coming. The mind didn't wake up slowly. It adjusted, like something that had noticed intruders, and changed its behavior to match them. By the third morning after the discovery, no one in dry camp number 3 slept well. Men who had spent years underground, men who could sleep through blasting and cave-ins, now woke before dawn with their hearts racing, certain they had heard something beneath the floorboards. Not voices, not screams, just that sound. 2 taps, a pause, 2 taps again, always from the direction of the ridge. It wasn't loud enough to be a warning. It wasn't frantic enough to be fear. It was steady, working. That was the word no one wanted to say out loud. Inside the mind, the air had changed. It felt heavier, warmer, as if the hill was holding heat instead of releasing it. Dust hung in the lamplight and moved in slow, deliberate currents even when no one stirred. The company manager, Briggs, pretended not to notice. He gave orders with clipped efficiency. Assigning positions like this was any other shift. But the pistol under his coat told a different story. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides behind authority. This time, Briggs chose only 2 men to go deeper with him. Fewer witnesses, fewer voices, fewer stories that could spread beyond the camp. They followed the rope back into the passage where the walls swallowed light. The stone there was no longer coal. It was darker, smoother, threaded with dull gray veins that absorbed lamplight instead of reflecting it. That's when the sound changed. Not louder, not faster, closer. Each step forward made it clearer that the tapping wasn't echoing randomly through the rock. It came from below them, from somewhere deeper than the chambers they'd already mapped. And it never lost rhythm. 2 taps, pause. 2 taps, like a signal, or a response. The next chamber was taller than the others. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The floor was smooth in places, worn flat by time and pressure. Pale stone fragments lay stacked in piles against the walls, sorted, not fallen. This wasn't collapsed debris, this was refuse. In the center of the room ran a shallow trough carved directly into the rock. Its edges were rounded, polished by use. Along its length clung dried residue. When Briggs touched it, he went still. The residue wasn't old. It wasn't dusty. It was red. Not rust, not mineral stain, fresh enough that it hadn't fully darkened. Historical horror encounters often hinge on a single moment when the explanation everyone is clinging to finally dies. That was the moment, because minds don't bleed. They backed out without argument. No heroics, no speeches, just controlled movement. The kind men use when panic is waiting just beneath the skin. Back in the lower chamber, the others saw their faces and understood immediately. No questions were asked. Orders followed quickly. Seal the passage. Reinforce the chamber. Say nothing outside this crew. Briggs framed it as procedure, safety, company policy. But safety doesn't explain why he refused to let anyone retrieve the pale fragments from the floor, or why he ordered the strip of skin left exactly where it lay, or why he didn't write a single word about the deeper chambers in the official notes. That night the sound came again. Not faint, not distant. It traveled through the ground like vibration through bone. Men stepped outside their tents without speaking, drawn by the same instinct that tells animals when something beneath the earth is moving toward the surface. The ridge stood silent under the stars. The tapping came from inside it. 2 taps, pause. 2 taps, longer this time. The Shoshone interpreter returned the next evening. This time only 1 elder came with him. The man didn't step fully into camp. He stayed near the edge of the lantern light, as if crossing an invisible boundary would invite something else to notice him. He spoke quietly. The interpreter's voice shook as he translated. He said the ridge held old rooms. He said hunters avoided it in winter. He said when the earth sleeps, something inside it does not. Briggs cut him off. Work was work. Coal was coal. Stories didn't pay wages. The elder raised his hand once, palm outward, not in warning but in farewell. That gesture stayed with the men longer than his words. The next morning they found new marks in the lower chamber, fresh depressions crossing over their own footprints, dust disturbed in a direction no one had traveled, drag marks leading into the deeper passage they had sealed. The seal hadn't been broken. That was the worst part. Whatever had come through hadn't used the opening. It had another way. Alvarez went pale. Connolly tightened his grip on his pick. Sparrow stopped pretending he was grown. Briggs stared at the marks for a long time without speaking. Then he made his decision. They would push deeper one last time. Not to explore, to confirm. That's another mistake history loves to repeat, thinking certainty is safer than ignorance. As they moved back toward the sealed passage, the air grew warm enough to dampen skin. Lamps burned steady now, no flicker, no struggle, as if the hill itself was feeding them oxygen. The tapping didn't stop. It matched their pace. Step, step, 2 taps. Step, pause. 2 taps. By the time they reached the narrowing throat of the deeper tunnel, no one doubted anymore. This wasn't a forgotten cave system. This was a place still in use, and whatever used it had learned something new about the men above. It had learned where they walked. It had learned how long they stayed. And it had learned that they could be made to come back. The moment they sealed the passage, they believed they were safe. They were wrong, because the hill didn't need the door they closed. It already had others. By the 4th day, the mine no longer felt abandoned between shifts. It felt occupied. Men noticed it first in small ways. Lamps left near the drift mouth burned lower than expected. Tools shifted from where they'd been set. Dust patterns changed overnight, not scattered, smoothed, as if brushed aside by something careful. No one admitted it openly. Miners survive by pretending fear is superstition. But every man walked faster past the ridge. Briggs announced the halt to underground work at dawn. Survey team coming. Company orders. Temporary shift to surface labor. Tipple expansion. Tailings clearance. Official words. Unofficial relief. Yet even above ground, the sound followed them. It came through the earth like a pulse, sometimes faint, sometimes strong enough to vibrate tin cups on the mess tables. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Never random. Never late. At night, men woke with the sensation of pressure in their chests, like air being drawn away somewhere beneath them. Sparrow started sleeping with his lamp lit. Connolly rubbed his hands raw. Alvarez prayed louder each evening. The Ward brothers said nothing. Silence can be its own confession. On the 6th night, the tapping stopped. That should have been comforting. It wasn't, because absence means movement. The next morning, a mule refused to go near the drift mouth. It planted its hooves and screamed like it had seen fire. When they forced it forward, it collapsed, trembling, foam on its lips. Animals don't imagine things. Neither do hills. Briggs gathered the original crew quietly and ordered one final inspection, not of the deep chambers, but of the sealed passage itself. He needed to see if it had shifted, cracked, been disturbed. He didn't say by what. Inside the drift, the air was wrong again. Cold near the entrance, warm farther down. The transition line was sharp enough to feel on the skin. Lamps burned too clean, casting shadows that seemed thicker than the objects making them. When they reached the sealed throat, everyone stopped. The timbers were intact, the wedges unmoved, the seal perfect. But the dust told another story. Marks ran along the walls where something had passed around the seal, not through it. Scratches too high for a crawling man, too narrow for a cave bear, too deliberate to be collapse damage. And beneath those scratches, smears. Dry, dark, still faintly red. Sparrow gagged and turned away. Briggs knelt and pressed his palm flat against the stone beside the seal. It was warm. That was when the sound returned. Not from below, from behind them. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Closer than it had ever been. Every man froze. The sound didn't echo like rockfall. It didn't scatter like loose stone. It traveled cleanly, as if carried through carved channels designed for it. Designed communication. They backed away together, lamps swinging, breath loud in the narrow space. No one ran. Running makes noise. Noise draws attention. When they reached the first chamber, they saw what had changed. The pale pillar was no longer untouched. New lines had been added to its surface, fresh, shallow cuts that crossed the older carvings. The pattern had changed. Where once it looked symbolic, now it felt responsive, like a record being updated. Near its base lay the strip of pale skin, except now it wasn't where they'd left it. It had been folded, carefully. Briggs swore for the first time since any of them had known him. That broke the spell. They retreated to daylight without orders, boots slipping on rails slick with condensation that hadn't been there before. Outside, the cold air felt thin and unreal. That afternoon, Briggs wired the company again, demanded the survey team immediately. He used words like hazard and instability. but he avoided the ones that mattered. That night, the ridge answered. The tapping began at dusk and didn't stop. It wasn't loud. It was persistent. It moved, sometimes from deep underground, sometimes from just beneath the camp, once from directly under the bunkhouse. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Men stood outside in silence, staring at the ground like prey listening for a burrow opening. Sparrow whispered what no one else dared. "What if it's counting?" No one laughed. Historical horror encounters often turn on realization rather than revelation. The truth doesn't appear, it settles. And that night, the men understood something together without speaking. The chambers weren't abandoned. They were occupied seasonally. The stone rings weren't ancient relics. They were used. The grooves weren't decoration. They were wear marks. And the tapping wasn't work. It was coordination. Just before dawn, Alvarez screamed. They found him outside his tent, knees in the dirt, clutching something pale and brittle. He rocked back and forth, repeating one word in Spanish over and over. Escamas. Scales. In his hands lay a fragment of curved, translucent material, thin, hard-edged, overlapping ridges like armor plates. Not skin. It hadn't been there the night before. Briggs ordered everyone back and locked the fragment in his office chest. He posted 2 men at the door. At sunrise, something else happened. The tapping stopped again, and from inside the ridge came a new sound. A long scrape. Slow, deliberate, like stone being moved aside by something that understood leverage. The hill wasn't responding anymore. It was preparing, because whatever lived beneath that Nevada ridge had finished observing. It knew the patterns now. It knew the entrances. And it knew that the men above believed the danger was contained. That belief would not survive another night. By the 7th day, the men realized something worse than being hunted. They were being studied, and the hill had begun making decisions. The survey team never arrived. That was the moment Hope quietly left dry camp number 3. The telegraph line was working. The rail spur was clear. Weather hadn't turned. There was no reasonable explanation, except one no one wanted to accept. The company wasn't coming. Briggs received a single wire at noon. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't explain. He simply told the men to keep working the surface detail and stay away from the ridge. And notice what isn't said. That afternoon, Sparrow followed Briggs when he thought no one was watching. The boy moved lightly, staying behind tailing piles, keeping low. He later told me Briggs had opened the chest in his office and taken out the pale, fragment Alvarez had found. Briggs held it near the window. And then, this is the part Sparrow swore on, Briggs dropped it like it burned him. That night, the tapping didn't come from underground. It came from the ridge itself. Not vibration, not echo, actual sound. Stone on stone. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. The ridge answered itself. Men stood frozen in their tents, afraid to breathe too loudly. The sound moved laterally now, traveling along the slope, testing distances as if mapping the surface. Then came something new, a third sound. A low, dry rasp like scales sliding over rock. Historical horror encounters rarely announce their escalation. They slip forward quietly until retreat is no longer possible. At dawn, the camp woke to damage. The rail ties nearest the ridge had been shifted. Not broken, not smashed, moved aside and stacked, neatly. A mule carcass lay 50 yards from the drift mouth. No blood, no torn flesh, just collapsed ribcage and a head turned too far backward. Neck twisted with deliberate force. Predators don't kill like that. Tools do. Briggs finally spoke the words he'd been avoiding. No one was allowed near the mine entrance anymore. Not even to secure equipment. Everything underground was to be abandoned. That decision came too late. Because the hill had already crossed into their world. Near midday, Sparrow disappeared. Not taken screaming. Not dragged. He was simply gone. His bunk was untouched. His lamp missing. Chalkboard gone. Tracks led from behind the bunkhouse toward the ridge and stopped. Not scattered. Ended. As if something had lifted him. The men formed a search party despite Briggs' orders. No one was willing to say the alternative out loud. They followed the tracks to the edge of the slope, where loose stone met packed earth. There, carved into the ground, was a shallow groove. Straight. Clean. The same width as the underground. Alvarez crossed himself and refused to go farther. That night, Briggs gathered the remaining men and told them the truth. What little of it he had, the company would not authorize evacuation. Payroll would be docked for abandonment. Anyone who left would be marked unreliable across every operation in the region. But Briggs didn't threaten them. He begged. He said the ridge wasn't supposed to be active yet, that the Shoshone stories talked about cycles, about deep seasons, about things that rose only when conditions were right. Coal mining, it seemed, was one of those conditions. That confession changed everything. Because it meant this wasn't an accident. It was a trigger. The tapping returned at dusk, closer than ever. It came from beneath the cookhouse, beneath the bunkhouse, beneath the rails, surrounding them. Men grabbed picks and shovels, not as tools, but as comfort. Connolly stood with his back to a tent wall, eyes wide, breathing through his teeth. Then the ground near the tailings shifted, not collapsed, opened. A narrow seam widened silently, stone sliding aside with careful precision. No explosion, no panic, just controlled movement, as if the earth itself had been trained. Something rose into the lantern light. Not fully, just enough. A ridged surface, dull, pale gray. Overlapping plates caught the light and reflected it poorly, like wet stone. The shape moved laterally, testing air, testing space, then withdrew. No attack, no rush, a demonstration. The message was clear. We can reach you. The men broke. Two ran into the darkness and were never seen again. One locked himself in the tool shed and refused to come out. Alvarez fell to his knees and prayed openly, loudly, daring whatever listened to hear him. Briggs stood frozen, pistol shaking in his hand. The tapping stopped. Silence followed. The worst silence any of them had ever known. Just before dawn, they heard Sparrow. Not his voice. His lamp. The faint clink of glass. It came from the drift mouth. Against every instinct, they approached together. At the entrance, Sparrow's lamp sat upright on the rail, clean, wick trimmed, lit. Next to it lay the chalkboard. On it was a drawing. Not a map, not symbols. A shape. Tall, broad, with elongated limbs and a ridged back. Below it, drawn in a child's careful hand, were marks mimicking the carvings from the pillar. The final line Sparrow had written wasn't a word. It was a pattern. 2 short lines. A space. 2 short lines again. Briggs dropped the pistol. At that moment, something deep beneath the ridge answered. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. But now there were others replying, from different directions, different depths. The hill wasn't home to one thing. It was a network. And dry camp number 3 was no longer outside it. The worst truth finally surfaced. The hill wasn't hunting them. It was collecting. By the 8th night, dry camp number 3 was no longer a workplace. It was a perimeter. Men didn't sleep in bunks anymore. They sat with their backs to walls, tools in hand, eyes fixed on the ground like sailors watching dark water for fins. Every sound felt intentional. Every vibration felt measured. The ridge had stopped testing. It had moved to control. Briggs finally broke. Authority drained out of him in a single evening. He admitted what the company records didn't show, what he'd been instructed never to document. This coal seam wasn't new. It had been abandoned once before. Years earlier, another exploratory crew cut into the same ridge. Fewer men, less equipment, less noise. They vanished within 3 weeks. Officially listed as a cave-in followed by fire. No bodies recovered. No follow-up. The ridge had been labeled geologically unstable, and then quietly reopened when demand rose. Because history, when buried deep enough, becomes permission. Briggs said the Shoshone elders had warned the company long before the first pick struck stone. They spoke of stonewalkers, of things that shed skin and slept in chambers carved before men kept time, of underground roots that connected hills like veins connect organs, not monsters. Neighbors who tolerated the surface, until disturbed. The pale fragments suddenly made sense. Not trophies, molts. That realization hit the men harder than any sound ever could, because molting means growth. That night the tapping changed again. It wasn't 2 taps anymore. It was layered, multiple rhythms overlapping, sometimes syncing, sometimes diverging like a conversation too complex to follow. From beneath the bunkhouse, from beneath the cookhouse, from beneath the rail spur, the ground had become a switchboard. Then the floor inside the tool shed cracked, not violently. Carefully, stone slid aside just enough to reveal darkness beneath. Cold air rose, dry and mineral-heavy. A ridged surface pressed briefly against the gap, testing resistance, then withdrew. The shed door was still locked, which meant it hadn't come through. It had come up. Men finally did what miners fear more than death. They ran. A group bolted toward the rail spur, intending to steal the handcar and push for the nearest town. They didn't make it 50 yards. The ground ahead of them lifted. Not burst. Lifted. A low arched form rose just beneath the surface, moving sideways beneath the soil, fast and smooth. The earth rippled like fabric over his shoulder. Then one man screamed. The sound cut off abruptly. No blood surfaced. No struggle. Just a depression in the dirt that slowly smoothed itself flat again. The others stopped running. You don't outrun something that doesn't need to surface. Briggs ordered everyone into the cookhouse, the thickest structure in camp. They barricaded doors with tables and crates. Lanterns were hung high. Tools stacked like weapons. No one pretended these would help. They waited. That's what historical horror encounters reduce men to in the end. Waiting. The tapping circled the building for hours. Sometimes directly beneath them, sometimes moving away, then returning. It felt deliberate, like pacing. Then came a new sound, scraping. Not stone on stone, stone on wood. The floorboards flexed. A narrow slit appeared between planks, wood bending upward rather than breaking. Something pale pressed against it from below, then withdrew. Testing again, the men realized the truth together. These beings weren't limited by the mine. The mine was merely one entrance. The Shoshone stories hadn't warned against digging because it woke the creatures. They warned because digging connected spaces that were meant to remain separate. At dawn, the tapping stopped. Briggs ordered the men out while daylight lasted. Abandon camp, walk, no rail. No equipment, just move. They made it less than a mile. The ground ahead collapsed, not inward, but outward, revealing a shallow trench that hadn't been there the day before. The trench ran parallel to their path, then curved to cut them off. They weren't being chased. They were being herded. Something rose from the trench. This time it didn't hide. It was tall but low to the ground, broad-backed, limbs longer than a man's, bent at unfamiliar angles. Its surface was plated in overlapping scales, dull and dry, catching light like weathered stone. Its head turned slowly. No eyes reflected the sun, just dark recessed hollows. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It tapped the ground once with a clawed limb, then paused, then tapped again. The same signal. Behind them, the earth answered. Multiple replies, different distances, same rhythm. The men dropped their tools. That act, small and instinctive, saved some of them, because the creature didn't advance. It waited, then moved aside. The message was unmistakable. This direction is allowed. They walked. Single file, silent, guided by tapping from below, redirected whenever they strayed. When one man panicked and broke formation, the ground beneath him rose and folded him down without violence. No scream, just disappearance. By nightfall, the survivors reached a dry wash miles from camp. The tapping faded. The ground went still. The ridge was no longer visible. Only then did the men realize something horrifying. They hadn't escaped. They had been released. Chosen. Allowed to leave so the story would travel, but not too clearly. Because vague fear protects better than truth. Years later, the rail spur was gone. The camp erased. Records sealed. Maps redrawn. But ranchers still report tapping under winter ground. Surveyors lose equipment near certain ridges, and miners refuse work where coal smells too dry, too sour. Because some hills aren't empty. They're occupied, and when you dig into them, you're not discovering history. You're reminding something ancient that you exist. They thought survival meant freedom, but survival was only permission, and permission can be revoked. The men who walked out of the Nevada hills never spoke as a group again. That wasn't an accident. History prefers its horror diluted, broken into fragments, whispered separately, never allowed to assemble into a single, undeniable shape. And that's exactly what happened to the survivors of Dry Camp Number 3. They scattered. One took farm work in Utah. Another drifted into rail labor and drank himself silent. Two vanished between towns, names erased as thoroughly as the camp itself. And Briggs? Briggs didn't make it past the winter. Official cause, pneumonia. Unofficial truth, he stopped sleeping. Because the tapping followed him, not in sound but in pattern. He heard it in clocks, in footsteps behind him that never closed the distance, in the way his heart sometimes beat twice, paused, then twice again. The company sealed all records connected to the ridge. The mine was struck from maps listed as an unprofitable exploratory failure. Surveyors were warned off. New claims were denied without explanation. But land remembers. Years later, homesteaders reported shallow sink lines forming overnight, always straight, always too smooth to be erosion. Cattle refused to graze near certain stone outcrops. Wells dug too deep went dry, or worse, released warm, mineral-heavy air that smelled wrong. Geologists blamed faults. Miners knew better, because miners understand a rule passed down without ever being written. If a hill sounds hollow, leave it alone. One of the survivors, Connolly, broke his silence in a saloon. In Reno in 1919, he was drunk, enough to forget fear but sober enough to remember details. He told a journalist that the creatures weren't reptiles as men imagined them. They weren't animals, he said. They were workers. He described hands built for leverage, claws shaped not for tearing flesh but for cutting stone, bodies that move sideways through soil like wedges, not burrowers. And most unsettling of all, they didn't react like predators, he said. They reacted like engineers. The journalist laughed it off and printed the story as a cautionary tale about drink and mining superstitions. The paper sold well. Fear always does when it's framed as fiction. Connolly died 2 weeks later. Found in his boarding room, floorboards beneath his bed pressed upward just enough to splinter. No tunnel, no hole. Just pressure marks in the wood and a single shallow groove running from wall to wall. Authorities said it was stress damage. No one explained how the boards bent upward. The Shoshone elders, when asked decades later, offered no new warnings, only confirmations. They said the stone walkers had always been there, long before rail lines, long before coal mattered. They lived in layers beneath the land, passing through ridges like crossroads. Most hills were quiet, some were doors, and doors once opened never truly close. During the 1930s, a federal road project cut through nearby terrain. Workers complained of tools dulling too quickly, picks striking stone that rang hollow beneath solid layers. A foreman ordered deeper blasting. The blast failed. The charges disappeared. No explosion, no collapse, just absence. The project was rerouted without explanation. During World War II, a military survey briefly evaluated the area for underground storage. The team reported temperature irregularities, unexplained air currents, and seismic readings that suggested controlled voids rather than natural caverns. The report was classified, not because of what it found, because of what it couldn't explain. By the 1950s, tapping reports returned, faint, rhythmic vibrations felt beneath new highways during winter months. Engineers blamed thermal contraction, but the rhythm never changed. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Always the same. Always patient. Then came the final detail, one that never made it into official records. In 1962, a boy hiking near a dry wash found something half buried in shale, pale, curved, overlapping ridges worn smooth by time. Not bone, not shell, a fragment. He brought it to a local museum. The curator locked it away and made a phone call instead. Within a week, men arrived. Federal men. No insignia. No paperwork shown. The fragment was removed. The boy's family was paid quietly. The museum burned down that winter. Electrical fire, they said. But the foundation showed something strange. The stone beneath it had been cut, not cracked. Clean edges, smooth walls, like the start of a chamber that had been abandoned mid-construction. Historical horror encounters rarely end with monsters revealed. They end with systems adapting. The creatures beneath Nevada didn't wage war. They didn't conquer. They adjusted boundaries. Humans were loud, temporary, curious, dangerous in short bursts, so the response wasn't violence. It was management. They redirected roads. They discouraged digging. They removed witnesses slowly and selectively. And occasionally, when necessary, they reminded the surface world who truly understood the land beneath it. Even now, miners tell stories of seams that answer back, of tools vibrating in rhythm, of underground chambers that feel warm, occupied and recently used. No one calls them lizard people anymore. That name is too simple, too human. Because what lived beneath that Nevada ridge wasn't hiding. It was coexisting, waiting for the next generation to forget the old warnings, waiting for the next pick to strike hollow stone. And when it does, The hill will answer. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Not as a threat. As a reminder, what finally escaped the Nevada hills wasn't a creature. It was a pattern, and patterns don't die, they migrate. By the time the 20th century learned how to listen to the ground, it was already too late. Seismographs began recording movements that didn't match earthquakes. Not sudden, not chaotic. Instead, measured, repeating, purposeful engineers dismissed them as calibration errors. Scientists blamed equipment drift, but miners knew better. Because the same rhythm that haunted Dry Camp Number 3 began appearing in places that shared only one thing in common. They had been dug too deeply. In Montana, a copper shaft was abandoned after workers reported tapping beneath the rails, always just ahead of their progress. In West Virginia, a tunnel crew swore the rock face was changing, between shifts, smooth where it had been rough, warm where it had been cold. In one case, a foreman marked a seam with chalk before leaving for the night. By morning, the chalk marks had been copied farther down the tunnel. Not smeared, copied. That's when the idea finally surfaced, quietly, reluctantly, among people who understood earth and pressure better than theory. These weren't isolated beings. They were connected. The Nevada Ridge wasn't a nest. It was a junction. The Stonewalkers didn't live beneath one hill. They lived between hills, moving through deep strata the way sailors move through currents. What humans thought of as solid ground was, to them, a layered passage system mapped, maintained, and occasionally closed. Coal seams weren't just fuel. They were access points. That explained the carvings, the pillars, the chambers that showed no signs of collapse despite impossible size. The troughs worn smooth by use. Maintenance. That explained why the tapping always came in pairs. One signal, one response. A check-in, a confirmation that a route was still open. When miners cut into those routes, they weren't trespassing in a home. They were interrupting traffic. Government agencies noticed patterns too, but they used different language. By the 1970s, internal reports described subsurface anomalies, exhibiting non-random adaptive behavior. The phrasing mattered. It avoided words like intelligence or agency. Those words frightened people. Instead, they talked about environmental management. They talked about containment through discouragement. Mines that showed irregular readings were quietly shut down, permits delayed, equipment lost in accidents, workers reassigned, stories labeled folklore. It was easier to make people doubt themselves than to explain what lived beneath them. One classified memo, leaked years later, contained a chilling line. The entities demonstrate no hostility unless provoked by structural intrusion or sustained observation, not attack, observation. That was the real danger. Watching them long enough to be noticed, watching back. Which brings the story back to Sparrow. Because Sparrow didn't just disappear. Years after Dry Camp Number 3 vanished from maps, a rancher found a chalkboard leaning against a dry arroyo wall miles from the original site. Sun-bleached, cracked, but unmistakable. On it were drawings. Not crude, accurate. Chambers layered beneath hills. Roots intersecting like arteries. Symbols repeated near junctions. And figures, tall, plated, jointed at unfamiliar angles, moving in coordinated groups. At the bottom, in handwriting older and steadier than a boy's should have been, were words. They don't live under the land. They live with it. The rancher burned the board. He said later he couldn't explain why, only that keeping it felt dangerous. That instinct saved him, because Sparrow's last drawings weren't warnings. They were lessons. The final realization, the one history tried hardest to bury, was this. The Stonewalkers didn't react to noise. They reacted to disruption. Small mining operations rarely triggered them, but industrial expansion did. Repeated blasts, deep drilling, long-term presence. Humans weren't prey. They were an invasive activity. And like any system that predates competition, the response wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Allow minor disturbance, redirect major intrusion, remove variables that won't adapt. That's why the survivors were released. That's why roads bent away from certain hills, why tunnels curved unexpectedly, why entire projects stalled without obvious cause. The Stonewalkers didn't erase humanity. They edited it. And editing is far more effective. By the time satellite imaging became common, anomalies appeared, subtle depressions, long shallow lines beneath terrain that shifted over decades, too slow to notice year by year. Obvious when compared across generations, not collapse. Migration. The Nevada ridge went quiet eventually. No tapping, no vibration, no reports. Not because the stone walkers left, because they rerouted, the network adjusted, which leaves one final unsettling question. Why do modern drilling crews still report hollow feedback before major discoveries? Why do certain mineral-rich regions resist excavation despite advanced technology? Why do some deep earth sensors register warmth where none should exist and then stop working entirely? The answer isn't that something ancient is waking up. It's that it never slept. It learned. And if the past teaches us anything, it's this. The earth doesn't belong to us. We borrow its surface. Everything below belongs to something else. Something patient, something coordinated, something that taps and waits for the answer. The tapping was never a warning. Warnings are loud. This was communication. The last confirmed report didn't come from a mine. In 1998, a deep earth research facility in the western United States built to study geothermal flow registered a vibration pattern beneath its lowest sensor array. The depth was wrong. Too shallow for mantle activity, too deep for groundwater, and the rhythm was unmistakable. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. The lead technician logged it as mechanical interference and prepared a recalibration. But before the system reset, something changed. The vibration answered itself. A second signal appeared on a separate array miles away, mirroring the rhythm perfectly, with a fractional delay consistent not with echo, but with response time. Someone in the room joked that the Earth was checking in. No one laughed. Because when they overlaid historical data from mining incidents, seismic oddities, abandoned shafts, the pattern aligned too cleanly. The same rhythm had appeared for over a century. Always before closures, always before disappearances, always before redirections. The lab shut down 6 months later. Budget cuts officially. But the final report included a sentence that never reached publication. The subsurface exhibits behavior consistent with a regulated transit system. Transit? Movement. Use. That word quietly rewrote everything, because it meant the stone walkers weren't tied to one era, or even one species. They weren't reacting to humans specifically. They were responding to pressure, to intrusion, to imbalance. Long before drills, before picks, before fire, something beneath the land learned how to keep the surface world from digging too deep, too fast. Not with force, with friction, slowing progress, redirecting ambition, removing outliers. The ultimate proof came not from Nevada, but from silence. In places where no one digs anymore, the earth is still. No tapping, no vibration, no resistance, as if the system recognizes cooperation. That's why the Shoshone never tried to expose what lived beneath them. They didn't worship it. They didn't fear it. They respected boundaries. And boundaries once learned don't need enforcement. The truth is darker and calmer than conspiracy theories suggest. There is no underground army preparing to rise, no invasion waiting for the right alignment. There is only an ancient infrastructure doing what it has always done, maintaining flow, protecting depth, ensuring that the surface never forgets one critical rule. The deeper you push, the more attention you attract. So if you ever walk through a canyon where sound dies too quickly, or stand on a hill that feels hollow underfoot, or hear a faint rhythmic vibration beneath a place that should be solid, don't run. Don't investigate. Just leave. Because the earth isn't speaking to scare you. It's asking a question, and once you answer back, you're part of the system. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps.